This is Sirens, a new series brought to you by the ladies of Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm on technology, governance, and national security issues, and maybe lure some men to their deaths. I'm Erin Simpson, and thanks for joining us for a mini episode which features our full-length interview with Laura Dickinson of George Washington Law School. If you already listened in the main feed, first, thank you, and second, you can probably skip ahead to the 12-minute mark. Otherwise, just sit back and listen. And now it's time for warning signs. Today we have with us Laura Dickinson. Laura is the Lyle T. Alverson Professor of Law at the George Washington University Law School. Hi, Laura. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Prior to her work at the GW Law School, Laura was actually special counsel to the General Counsel at DOD and served as a senior advisor at the State Department. And earlier in her career, she was a Supreme Court clerk. So she's a wonderful person to help explain some of these issues that we want to talk about today. This segment sort of first started when we were looking at the Supreme Court ruling, or at least announcement around the president's pocket rescissions of foreign aid and kind of what the spending powers and the role of the executive there might be. But we quickly realized that this was part of a larger story around separation of powers. And as Laura very well knows, and certainly our listeners probably do too, national security has always been a tricky area for the judicial and legislative branches. But we've also seen the Trump administration rely on emergency powers for everything from tariffs to National Guard deployments. So this question around the role of the executive, whether there's any restrictions on the executive, is really back to the forefront for many of us. So we want to use this discussion to talk about the continuation of this trend and recent executive actions and the court response, and also thinking about how we calibrate those authorities when national security is invoked for nearly everything. So with all that said, Laura, let's start with the big picture. If you were meeting your 2023 self or even your 2015 self, tell us the story of maybe how separation of powers have shifted and what in the last 9 months you would really pay attention to.
I would note that due to shifts on the Supreme Court, we've seen the rise of a new theory of broad executive power called the unitary executive theory that's really shaping a lot of outcomes in judicial decisions. And this theory holds that the executive branch has quite significant power in relation to the other branches of government, Congress and the courts, and that the president wields sweeping authority within the executive branch. I think this theory is, in fact, fueling what we might call power grabs by the current president. And more specifically, right, the theory relies on this idea that the vesting clause of Article 2 of the Constitution says that all executive power shall be vested in the president. So the idea is that all executive power means that everyone within the executive branch must be directly accountable to the president. And the Congress can't create through so-called independent agencies or civil service protections limits on the president's ability to hire, fire, or directly supervise anyone in the executive branch.
I guess that's really interesting, and I hadn't heard it framed in quite that way before. Is that related then, as we sort of think about the Trump administration specifically, to this invocation of national emergencies, or the reliance on maybe that theory or other clauses for things like tariffs and other activities?
Yes. But even before we get to national security, which, as you point out, has been a place where the courts have exercised deference to the president historically, not unlimited deference, but deference. Um, this theory of the unitary executive is reshaping executive power more broadly. So even apart from national security, this administration is relying on that theory to do all sorts of things that in the past we would have thought of as flatly unlawful. So, for example, President Trump has fired the heads of agencies that federal law says can only be fired for cause. He's fired thousands of federal workers, including workers who are protected by statutory civil service protections.
Mhm.
He's terminated tens of billions in grants and contracts. He's claimed the power to reallocate or not spend funds that are specifically designated by Congress, and that arguably violates Article 1's spending clause that gives Congress the power to allocate money, and Article 2's take care clause, which provides that the executive must take care that the laws be faithfully executed. He's worked to virtually eliminate entire agencies such as USAID, and he's also imposed tariffs unilaterally without Congress. So all of these things encroach on, if not trample, the powers of Congress. And the unitary executive theory is fueling this. And this sort of adds to this historical deference that the president gets in general when the president is exercising national security powers.
As you're
So I
telling the
guess
story, I am thinking of how on earth, as a law professor, you or any others who are actually teaching law to law students at this point in time, how on earth you are managing to describe both what is supposed to happen versus what is actually happening right now, and how to grapple with that in real time. And like the way you just described it, like we've been talking about these issues over the course of the podcast, but all in one package is just an absolutely monumental change from where we were even several years ago, but even where we were in January, frankly. Out of the things that have happened in that last 9 months, are there any court rulings or events that specifically caught your eye that were particularly game changing or opened up doors much, much wider than they had been before, either in the national security space as we were talking about, or more broadly?
Yeah, so even going back before this administration, I would point to a case called Sela Law, in which the Supreme Court said that the president has the authority to hire and fire at will the head of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, despite a statute that mandated that the head could only be removed for cause. So that case, I think, sets the stage for this broad theory of executive power, the unitary executive theory. Another case that was really important was the decision that President Trump had immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts. And although that case wasn't directly about the unitary executive theory, there's language in that decision that expresses the view that the president has to have a lot of power, has to be unfettered by concerns that decisions could lead to criminal prosecution outside. If once the president is outside of office. So I think the backdrop of those cases, even before this administration came into office, is really important. And this goes way beyond national security, but obviously it has added importance in the national security space. Now, there's some more recent cases I'm happy to talk about that have been coming up given the actions of this administration.
Yeah, I think we'd certainly be interested in hearing more about that. The new term has, just begun, I think, last week, and there have been a lot of cases come up, I guess, through the shadow docket. Which I'll be honest, if I knew about it, I hadn't paid a lot of attention to it previously. But it sounds like those are places where the court has given essentially expedited interim rulings, and maybe you can tell us, Laura, whether those cases will now come back for full hearings at some point if they're on the docket for the fall or the spring. But definitely interested in kind of what you've seen in the last few months that continue this trend, or maybe
Yeah,
push back against it. I don't know if there's been examples where the court has given some pause.
there are a few, but in general, the court has been really siding with this administration. So there's been a lot of litigation because the actions of this administration are really pushing at the edges, or perhaps pushing across long-standing understandings of what is lawful on the part of the government. And so a lot of the lower courts have been issuing what we call stays or injunctions of actions that the government is taking based on the idea there's a likelihood that these cases will succeed on the merits. So, sort of preliminary rulings. And those rulings have been going up to the Supreme Court. Um, and the court has been sort of issuing very terse decisions without much explanation. And this is often called, the shadow docket, because the court doesn't ask for briefing, doesn't get oral argument, doesn't get the benefit of deliberation, serious deliberation, and they're just ruling really quickly. They don't have to do that. They could just decide to leave those lower decisions in place. But this court is not doing that. They are reaching out and they are undoing the injunctions that the lower courts are issuing in these terse rulings and cryptic rulings. And they're often ruling for the executive branch, often on what I might call proceduralist grounds. So they're not necessarily getting to the substance of the claims, but they're making these proceduralist rulings. So let me give some examples. So they're saying in a lot of cases that the people who are suing most likely don't have standing to sue. They're saying, with respect to the massive terminations of contracts and grants, that these cases can't be brought in the federal courts in the first instance. They have to go to a court called the Court of Federal Claims, which is where you sue on contracts related to agreements between you and the federal government. With respect to the cases about firings of workers, they're saying, no, you can't go into federal court in the first instance. You have to go to this other body, the Merit Systems Protection Board. They're saying some of these cases are not ripe. It's not the time to bring them up. They're saying in some of these cases that there's no cause of action to sue. So, for example, in the case challenging the cutoff of funds to USAID, challenging this as an unconstitutional rescission, as an unconstitutional act by the executive branch, interfering with Congress's appropriation power. The court is saying, at least on this emergency docket, as a preliminary matter, that there doesn't seem to be a cause of action in this litigation for the suit. In the case that's challenging birthright citizenship, which seems to be a pretty clear mandate in the US Constitution, they're saying that a court can't issue a nationwide injunction blocking this. Instead, you have to sue in each separate district on each specific case. There are also some pretty significant rulings on substantive matters as a preliminary matter that I'm happy to go into as well, that have where the Supreme Court has sided with the executive branch.
Laura, why don't you tell us about some of those substantive matters?
Well, one that's gotten a lot of attention is a case called Perdomo, where the lower court said that the immigration enforcement policies of this administration, in particular, the decision to stop and detain people suspected of being here unlawfully, was unconstitutional racial profiling. The lower court said there was a likelihood that that claim would succeed on the merits, and went up to the Supreme Court on the so-called shadow docket, and the court revoked the injunction, stayed the injunction that the lower court had issued in a really terse, decision. But Justice Kavanaugh suggested that the government does have the ability to at least temporarily detain people.
These were the Kavanaugh stops that people are now referencing.
Yes, the Kavanaugh stops to detain people based on reasonable suspicion, and that reasonable suspicion could include the fact of their race. And also with respect to the Alien Enemies Act enforcement. So the Trump administration has relied on this very old wartime authority for deporting non-citizens who are enemies. And it's used that authority to deport people such as Venezuelans. And there have been a lot of challenges of this as illegal beyond the scope of the president's authority. On its sort of emergency docket, the Supreme Court said that, that policy couldn't be challenged as a whole, that only cases could be brought based on habeas claims in the specific district where each person was individually being held. So that's a case where there is a little sliver of a possibility there for the litigants, because the court sort of seemed to endorse this idea of habeas as a way to challenge, proceedings under the Alien Enemies Act. But it did make it a lot harder for litigants.
Contrary to some of the examples that you just walked through, you've done a lot of work over the last several years around how courts could or should be less deferential to the executive, and particularly in cases of national security. If you, I definitely recommend folks, definitely taking a skim, but also probably taking a read if they can to Laura's paper on protecting U.S. national security state from a rogue president. But I wanted to press on this a little bit in terms of where are there areas where courts right now are deferring hevilly to the executive via state secrets or other things where they actually do have the opportunity to push back harder, or maybe they should be thinking about different levers by which they should be pushing back harder?
Yeah, so let's talk about the domestic use of the military, and let's talk about national security specifically, because this is one place where the president has relied on so-called emergency and national security authorities to exercise really, really broad power, putting the military on the streets of cities from LA to Portland to Chicago to DC. And I guess first, by way, and this is a place where the courts have an opportunity. But by way of backdrop, I should just note that in our constitutional tradition, both in the Constitution itself, which gives a lot of control to Congress over regulating how we use the military, the kind of statutes that we have seen over the course of our history, the United States is really kind of reluctant to have the military do law enforcement on U.S. soil. And that's reflected in the fact that the Posse Comitatus Act makes it criminal for the military under federal control to do law enforcement. That's only allowed when certain exceptions come into play. So, for example, there's a statute, the Insurrection Act, which gives the president the authority to use the military in really extreme cases. And that is an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act. But presidents across both parties have been really, really cautious about invoking that. It's only been invoked like 30 times in U.S. history. And even this president has not invoked it. But he has relied on another statute, Section 10 USC 12406, to send the military into some states and federalize the National Guard without those governors' consent. There's a strong case that is really not allowed by the statute. And so we've seen some litigation here, both in California, in the Newsom v. Trump case, now in Oregon. Oregon has challenged that, and then in Illinois as well. What we've seen is actually some district court decisions where the courts have said, actually, the statutory conditions for doing this are not met. This is something that is really rare, should only be used in a time of rebellion, invasion, failure to execute the laws. That's like a serious, serious breakdown of law and order, a real last resort type situation. We don't have that here. The appellate courts so far have been a little more deferential. This is where we're seeing national security deference kicking in a little bit. They're saying, wait a minute, the president's interpretation of those statutory terms gets some leeway. But what's interesting is that the language in those decisions is not as broad as what the government is arguing for. They're saying we do give a little leeway to the president, but it's not absolute deference. So I think it's going to be really important to see how this unfolds. This is a place where the courts really could put some boundaries around what the president can do, even in the national security context.
So I think maybe if we, look ahead a little, both to some cases that might come up for full hearing in this Supreme Court term, or even some of the, recent events. I'm not a budget nerd, but I'm an appropriations watcher, and so just the idea of, using, money from different accounts, research and development, in order to pay salaries for, uniformed troops. And to everyone outside DC, that's like a nonsense color of money question, but it defines our daily existence around
Yes.
here.
It's
We've
deeply
talked about
offensive to everyone else. Yeah.
we've talked about deployment of the military. We've talked a little bit about tariffs. What are you looking ahead to, Laura, either as things that have already been accepted, for this term, or things that are likely to come up that we should keep an eye on?
Well, you mentioned tariffs. So the Supreme Court has granted cert to actually review the president's decision to issue tariffs, some of the tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, known as IEPA. And the lower courts there have said that he likely doesn't have the authority to do this because the statute doesn't actually refer to tariffs. It talks about sanctions, and there are certain conditions that are necessary to impose sanctions related to national security. So the Supreme Court is going to be deciding this question. I think it's really one to watch closely because it really goes to how much power the president has vis-a-vis Congress, right? When Congress is not clearly given that authority to the president, can he just claim it unilaterally? And I do want to mention that there is another doctrine here that might work in favor of checking the president. And this is a doctrine that's emerged recently called the major questions doctrine, where the Supreme Court has sort of looked skeptically at the idea that you would defer to executive branch agencies in their regulatory power, unless if it involves a major question, Congress has to really clearly give those executive branch agencies that power. So it'll be really interesting to see how the court interprets the major question doctrine and determines whether it applies here to IEPA, because IEPA doesn't say anything about tariffs. So under the major questions doctrine, you'd think, okay, this is a major question, right? Major tariffs. There's no tariff authority, so the president can't do that. But the president may try to say the major question doctrine doesn't apply to the president. So that's really something to watch. Another big case that's going to be important is the case about whether or not the president has broad authority to fire heads or members of independent agencies. So the case that the court has actually granted on involves the Federal Trade Commission. And that's really significant because it'll affect a lot of independent agencies. And one big question is, well, what does that mean for the Fed, the Federal Reserve? And they've also granted cert in a case involving the administration's attempt to fire Lisa Cook, who's a member of the Federal Reserve, who by statute can only be fired for cause. And there, the administration is saying that there is cause based on these very sort of dubious facts. And so it'll be interesting to see what the court says there about the president's power over the Federal Reserve, which is obviously a source of great concern to the US economy and the global economy, having independence of the Federal Reserve to make monetary policy.
So we've really sort of toured the waterfront on a lot of different opportunities or challenges that we see to separation of powers. Lauren mentioned your great paper on rogue presidents, which has some ideas for some new institutional guardrails. We'll let you get out of here on this question, which is, what are some opportunities to maybe reset some of these relationships? What are some things that our listeners can look to, or perhaps help shape, that might bring a bit more balance to this idea of the unitary executive?
Yeah, so there's things that Congress can do, things the courts can do, and things that the executive branch can do. Obviously, it would require change in circumstances in each of these branches of government, but I think it's really important to think about these things now, so that when the circumstance arises, the institutions are really ready to address these issues. Because I think executive overreach is a real problem and threatens US democracy in so many ways. So, with respect to Congress, I think Congress really should tighten up these emergency authorities, the National Emergencies Act, IEPA, the Alien Enemies Act, the Insurrection Act, the 10 USC 12406, right? These statutes that give the president authority, which I argue should be interpreted narrowly based on our constitutional history and tradition, in which some courts are doing. But there's a lot of leeway still in these statutes. And it's important for presidents to have emergency powers, but we see the risks of abuse. So I think Congress should tighten up these statutes, and also make sure that it provides explicit causes of action to sue to kind of defeat this argument that's cropping up in the Supreme Court, that there's no cause of action, and so you can't get into federal court. So I think that's really important. With respect to the courts, I think it's really important to push back on this idea of a really, really broad unitary executive. There's actually some interesting originalist work being done. Supreme Court loves originalism right now, this idea that you look to history to understand the meaning of the Constitution. Well, there's an argument that this idea of the unitary executive is really not an originalist idea. So I think that's important. I think, there needs to be pushback on these really limited standing doctrines. I think you mentioned state secrets, which shields the executive from litigation when they assert that a state secret is involved in litigation. And courts have been interpreting this doctrine pretty broadly. I think that it's overbroad, their interpretation. And there, I think it's interesting because you've got some potentially unlikely people on the Supreme Court who might agree that it's overbroad, like Neil Gorsuch, who dissented in a really important state secrets case recently, the Zubaida case, and said that limits on state secrets are crucial to the rule of law. Arguably, we have to restore the sort of vision of the separation of powers in the national security space that's reflected in the historic decision in Youngstown Steel, where the court famously checked President Truman when he tried to seize the steel mills during the Korean War.
I saw that in your paper, and I thought to myself, man, that would be like what would the ruling be like if it happened today, right? And it's actually, you look at the activity with Intel, and some of these other kind of even TikTok, and it's not such a far reach, right? That there would be executive action that would essentially nationalize or effectively nationalize a large part of industry. So that was a very interesting reference that I certainly hadn't thought of in probably 20 years, but is oddly relevant for a whole variety of reasons now. So
absolutely. And I would just add that, the executive branch, if it's sort of helmed by someone who thinks that executive power should not be quite as broad, can actually do a lot within the executive branch to sort of define the boundary of what's an appropriate use of executive power and what isn't, through, issuing more opinions from the Office of Legal Counsel. But also, one last thing I just want to note, and maybe this is a big one, is through the government contracts that the executive branch enters into with so many entities, whether in the national security space or elsewhere, whether it's the entities that provide foreign aid, whether it's the entities that do, military construction overseas, whether it's the entities that do research at universities, whether, there's just so much power that the government wields through contracts. And what we've seen in this administration is they're wielding that by cutting off the contracts. Well, there's a way to address that, which is to write the contracts differently, right? To say, look, they can't be terminated at the government's convenience. They have to follow sort of, if you're going to cut off billions in foreign aid, you have to follow procedures. You have to follow what Congress says, but you also have to follow procedures, and those could be written into the contract. So, a lot of the power that's being wielded right now is in part because we've privatized and turned over to contractors a lot of what we do. USAID was a uniquely privatized agency, and that gave the president extra levers. But those levers can be affected. Those levers can be addressed by writing the contracts differently. So that's what I would argue for.
you've given us so much to think about, and we really appreciate your time. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again to Laura for joining us. Before you go, if you would please do us the loveliest favor and leave a rating or review in Apple or Spotify, it would be most appreciated. And if process is truly your Valentine, please share this episode with a friend. Thanks!